So, I'm a pretty big fan of the Silent Hill series, at least the original few games. I've just recently played the first Silent Hill game for the first time on PS1, and enjoyed it. Silent Hill 2 is probably my favorite, as it still creeps me out a bit to this day. Silent Hill 3 was pretty good too, but it just didn't have the same scare factor as 2. Silent Hill 4, The Room, the game I'm playing for this week's review, was a game that I picked up at GameStop a long time ago. Yet, when I originally played it, something just wasn't clicking, and I never really got that far into it. So I figured since I'm reviewing horror-based games this month, why not give it another go to see why I couldn't play it for long periods of time before? Well, after giving it another few hours, I can honestly say my feelings haven't changed. Let me explain why. Silent Hill 4, The Room, has you playing as a man named Henry Townsend, who lives in South Ashfield Heights, room 302. According to the story, 5 days ago, he got locked in his apartment, with locks and chains securing his only way out. Not the greatest situation to be in, Henry finds himself just roaming his apartment, looking out the few locked windows. He eventually finds a hole in his bathroom, and having no other choice, climbs through it. He lands on an escalator of all things, which leads him to the subway that runs underneath the town of Ashfield. He begins exploring these dark tunnels in an attempt to figure out what is going on and how to escape. Right from the start, you'll notice that the game controls a bit differently than its predecessors. In the room itself, you move around in a first-person perspective, and camera control, although done with the right stick, isn't as smooth as, say, a first-person shooter. It works fine enough in these segments, though. Once you get into the creepier parts of the world, Silent Hill 4 shifts to its normal third-person perspective. In these, the game dumps the tank controls of the previous games, instead opting for a more direct way of moving Henry around. Pressing the left stick will move the character in that direction, which most players may argue does make things a bit easier. Personally, I've never been a tank control hater. I've always thought that it was easy enough to work with, and that it especially worked great with static camera angles, since pressing up always moved you forward, no matter where you were on the screen. Anyway, if you haven't played a Silent Hill game before, or even a survival horror game, this is how it works. You are a lone character in a world filled with hostile creatures that want you dead. These enemies are usually monstrosities that look like they came from your deepest, darkest nightmares. You are given a melee weapon, in this case a series staple steel pipe, and eventually a firearm with very limited ammunition. It's usually best to avoid combat when you can, and save your ammo until you really need it. This all stands true in Silent Hill 4, but they did a few things differently here that are a major change from prior games in the series. The biggest one is the fact that you now have a very limited amount of spaces in your inventory. In the previous Silent Hill games, you can bring whatever you picked up with you at all times. In The Room, you are restricted to about a dozen or so slots. Compounding this issue, each ammo box you pick up counts as its own slot. So every 10 bullets fills up a new space, filling your pockets quickly if you tend to save your ammo for critical situations like I tend to do. Because you can find a lot more items than you can carry throughout your playthrough, you are given an item chest in your room. See, at multiple points in the game, you'll encounter additional holes in the walls of the areas that you are walking around in. By hopping in one, you'll return to Henry's room. This acts as a safe room of sorts, where you can see if there's any new updates to the reasoning of his captivity, deposit unneeded items in the item box, or save the game. In fact, this is the lone area where you can save the game, and if you don't have the manual, it may take a bit of time to realize that you have to interact with this diary here to save. Unlike previous games, which contained what was normally a glaringly bright red object to interact with, The Room features just a book that could blend in with other objects. I feel like this could have stood out a little bit better. Anyway, you don't get multiple holes to jump into as you encounter more in the world. Instead, by crawling through the hole in your apartment, you'll return to the last hole you interacted with. My issue with this is that although it's not terribly long, you'll have to enter one of these and wait for a loading screen on both sides just to save the game or interact with an item chest. Sure, you can argue that Resident Evil games did this for a while, but prior Silent Hill games had the save points in the open, without requiring lengthy load times. Maybe I'm nitpicking on some of my complaints, and I can definitely see the argument that these aren't big deal. However, Silent Hill 4 just bored me to tears, which made me notice the subpar design choices. With that said, it's time to talk about the world. As much as I hate to keep doing this, let's compare it to its older brothers. In these games, you typically run around in Silent Hill itself, the fog-laden town with no one in sight but horrific abominations. You get some plot expose, get to a building, and explore that area for an hour or two before fighting a boss and move on with the game. This is fine. This worked. But in Silent Hill 4, at least from what I've played so far, there's no real mention of the town of Silent Hill. The game takes place in a town called Ashfield. The areas you run around in are much less creepy, even though the game tries. The subway, an abandoned prison tower, a derelict forest. From what I've read, there are 6 or so areas that you can explore, but they are all much more linear than past zones. And each can be completed in about 20 minutes or so if you know where to go. There are also some holes everywhere, with these checkpoints being found every 5 rooms or so you can heal up and save frequently, dumbing down the challenge. These areas are also listed in the save files as worlds, so you have Forest World, Subway World, and so on. This just sounds dumb to me in a game like this. What is this, a horror-themed Mario game? May as well get Henry a plumber suit. Adding to this, the puzzles that you encounter aren't that difficult. There were some serious brain scratches in prior games, but I haven't run into anything all that difficult in Silent Hill 4. This makes the game more of a walk around, avoid enemies, and find the item that progress the story to end this world kind of game. Combat. There are some welcome additions here. A health meter is displayed in the top left of the screen, which is a welcome addition. I understand that it takes away some of the suspense, but pausing to see your health always kind of annoyed me slightly, but not enough to ever make me stop playing one of these kinds of games. There aren't nearly as many healing items to be found in the world, but this is alleviated by the fact that every time you enter your room, your health slowly regenerates. For obvious reasons, this makes the game a bit easier to play, as it's much more difficult to die. Still possible if you're not careful, but much harder to do so. Secondly, you now have a power meter in the form of a circle to the right of your health meter. By holding R2 to go into the fighting stance, and then holding X that would normally attack, Henry would charge up power into this gauge. Once it's full, Henry will swing the currently equipped melee weapon with much more force, doing more damage to whatever it hits. This is fine and all, but I found that for the most part, doing normal swings is all you need. Henry has a decent melee combo, which, although not causing as much pain to your enemies, will usually be enough to disrupt any attack that they might be mounting. You can also evade the monster's attacks by pressing circle in a direction while in the combat stance. This honestly might be one of the best new features of the game. You can now have more say in how you defend, as you can try staying out of reach of, say, a dog's lunge while you strike after they miss. Add in the ability to swap items on the fly using the D-pad, and you'll find that this game might have some of the easiest combat encounters in the series. Well, there is a caveat to that. There are times where there is some questionable hit detection and auto-locking. There have been times where I was just trying to attack one enemy, but when I pressed R2, Henry looked at a different one that might have been less of a threat or further away. This kinda sucks. As for the hit detection, it's usually not too bad, but there are these enemies here that will emerge from the walls and attempt to slap you down. The first time you encounter them, they're in the subway tunnels as you are climbing up an insanely lengthy escalator. They tended to strike me when I was clearly out of their reach, pushing me further down the ramp and forcing me to attempt to get past them again. And this stretches on forever. Yes, there are ways that you can simply run past before they swipe, but oftentimes this doesn't matter, as you are definitely out of their range, but they hit you anyway. Who on the development team thought this was a good idea? This was one of the most frustrating areas of the game that I ran into, and I almost stopped here. But I didn't, which brings me to another annoying enemy type, the ghosts. These guys also come out of the walls, but then they chase you around from area to area. As long as they are close to you, the screen will get a red tint and you'll take consistent damage. But if they grab you, you'll take much more and be stunned for a few seconds as they complete their attack. Using melee weapons against these guys, or really fighting them in general, isn't recommended, as they just get back up if you knock them down. I did run into a sword in a later area that claims that they can permanently stop them while the blade is plunged through their chest. But after picking it up, the enemy simply started chasing me, and I couldn't figure out how to stop him again. I wasn't a fan of Nemesis / Mr. X in the Resident Evil games, and I'm not a fan of these ghosts either. At least they are typically easy enough to avoid. Let's talk about the enemies for a sec too. They're incredibly generic, well, at least for a Silent Hill game. You have the typical monster dogs, complete with flashing tongues. You have giant bugs that do a minuscule amount of damage. Those stupid wall slappers. Hulking beasts that have two heads and walk around on massive arms. These, I don't even know what they're supposed to be. All of them seem to lack the real spook factor that you encountered before. Remember the first time you encountered Pyramid Head staring at you through the bars in the apartment complex? I do. I nearly crapped myself. Not once did I get that feeling here. It's like the development team went for odd enemies, not disfigured monsters that would hunt you in your sleep. And in the fact that most of these enemies have incredibly generic sound effects, and that hurts the game's appeal even further. The dogs sound like jaguars when you step on them. At least, I think it's a jaguar. It's some sort of exotic cat, and it's a sound effect I've heard in countless other games. Pitfall the Mayan Adventure comes to mind. Even these guys just laugh in a tone that seems to lack emotion while screaming, again, kind of like an exotic feline. It just wasn't helping to lure me further into the game. And that's the problem. No matter how much I tried, I could not get truly invested in Silent Hill 4. The linear areas, lackluster puzzles, at times poor hit detection, and slow story pacing did little to keep me hooked, forcing me to play the game in 30 to 60 minute chunks before I wanted to take a break to play something more interesting. Even its links to Silent Hill itself were limited, with no fog, no flashlight, no radio, just a bit of darkness and enemies that looked semi-disturbing, along with frequent references to a character you only read about in Silent Hill 2. Maybe the game picks up later, as I only got about 3 hours into the game before calling it quits due to being bored out of my mind. You'll have to let me know if I should stick with it, or just call it quits for good. Silent Hill 4 The Room isn't a terrible game, but it's far from great. Final score? 4 out of 7. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.